Mike, thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the opportunity to come back to my alma mater, and hopefully for a lot of the student body, soon to be your alma mater. And it's good to see a few people that are able to come back and participate here as well. So this room we're in, I think, used to be the post office when I was over at the business school. And so it's amazing over time to see how the place changes, how modern and up-to-date it is once you come inside, but how integrated it is with the campus. So an incredible honor to get to be back. And my first time here talking directly to students about foreign policy. So in the House of Representatives, I serve on financial services, and that lines up pretty nice with the business school. But I also serve on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And so when I first ran for office, kind of the cliff notes of the resume was Army Ranger business guy. And in Congress, it's pretty similar, though financial services probably takes more of a prominent role than the Foreign Affairs Committee. And that's because the Foreign Affairs Committee hasn't been very assertive. We're in a period where executive power is what dominates foreign policy for our country. So I thought I'd introduce the talk of peace through strength is the widely known phrase. It's been referenced as such going back to George Washington and made really famous by Reagan. And part of what he believed would win the Cold War proved to win the Cold War. And frankly, the Soviet Union had a fatal flaw, and they could not spend at the rate the U.S. economy could, and they defaulted. What they've proved is bankrupt countries are really hard to defend. And so the United States won the Cold War, and we've really floundered ever since. We haven't really figured out exactly what to do with all this power. For a while, we were the, quote, only superpower, and I guess that felt lonely, so we felt, well, we better find a way to create some more superpowers. And we were busy doing that with China in particular when 9/11 happened. And for a while, we were laser focused on fighting and winning the war on terror. But they developed in 2004 this idea that they would change the mission in Afghanistan from defeating terrorists to nation building, that we would create some democratic republic out of Afghanistan. And they had this phrase, as much as it takes, as long as it takes, without ever saying to do what. And that's how you wind up doing something really embarrassing, like flying a mission accomplished banner on an aircraft carrier when everyone knows that, well, the mission hasn't exactly been accomplished yet. That's where we went into Iraq and proceeded to do the same thing, which is we're going to create some democratic republic of Iraq, while the most democratic people that we might want to have helped build it are fleeing and getting refugee status in America. And where they intentionally disbanded the army and let them keep the weapons. So all kinds of things about that you're like, was the intent to win that war, or was the intent to wage that war? And I'll save that for a different talk, but I think the underlooked corollary to peace through strength is strength through peace. The op-tempo should be self-evident that if you're always on the go, you're not necessarily stronger. So you have to have these rest and recovery periods. So in football, for example, they build a tempo that's different than baseball because the sport is tougher on your body. And you play a handful of games, where a baseball season can be much longer, and you could play multiple games. You wouldn't think about playing a doubleheader in football, but you play doubleheaders in baseball. And so the op-tempo in war, you certainly have different levels of intensity in combat. But when you have these sustained wars, what you find is it leaves our country less free, less safe, and more burdened by debt. And I'll talk about the less free part first. So when I enlisted in the Army in 1988, I got over to Germany in early 1989. And by November of 89, I was down in Bad Tolz, Germany, training with 10th Special Forces Group. And the E7 that was giving us a talk says, write this day down, 9 November 1989. It's going to be one of the most famous days in history. And I thought, pretty bold intro to your talk. And of course, I didn't say that because I was a private and he was an E7. But he proceeded to say, no, the Berlin Wall has come down. Mr. Gorbachev didn't tear the wall down. Mr. Reagan, then H.W. Bush, didn't tear the wall down. The East German people finally tore their own wall down. They found out the truth, and for once they were able to break through and not lose their lives for trying to get to freedom. They were not looking for more government. They were already suffering from a near fatal overdose of government. They wanted more freedom. I got to speak to a guy who was, my age. I was 19 at that time. He was, in that age range, and he could speak some English. I could speak some German at that time, so we're communicating. He's like, is it like this everywhere? And I said, well, no, we have small towns and everything too, because we were in the Kudam district, which is kind of like Times Square is for New York City, Kudam district of Berlin. And he said, no, the stores are open at night and there's fresh milk. And I'm like, well, yeah, and I'm trying to explain like a 7-Eleven to him, and it's a total alien concept to him. He's like, so like, there's always stuff on the shelves and everyone can go in, like all the time. It's not just like a show for us. And I go, no, they want everyone to go in, so they sell more stuff. He's like, well, if they sell the stuff, like, how do they keep it stocked? And I'm like, you're just realizing it's a completely different economic system. And you look at the linkage of economics in power, and I think that's one of the things that we tend to discount. We've taken for granted because we came out of World War II as the economic powerhouse. We were, with the Marshall Plan, paying to rebuild Western Europe, or at least heavily subsidizing it. We were creating international institutions that, while they are international institutions, they were essentially pro-America institutions. And so those institutions like the World Bank, like the International Monetary Fund, come together, and really the most basic part of it happened in Bretton Woods. Just before the end of the war, in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, they decided that they were going to have a global reset of what? Of the monetary system. So at that time, the U.S. had about as much debt to GDP as we have today. But the difference was we knew we couldn't keep doing it. We knew at the end of a war, you have to do what you always do throughout history, is pay down the debt. Right now, there is no will to do any of that. So that's where you see some people talking about another, quote, great reset or global reset. Of what? Of the monetary system. Well, at the Treaty of Bretton Woods, we were not the world's reserve currency. We were rivals. It wasn't clear the pound sterling was fading, but we became locked in as the world's reserve currency. And at that time, we pegged to gold. And then in 71, there's an interesting website related to this as a sidebar. WTF happened in 1971.com. I'm not sure what the WTF means, but in 1971.com. And they don't really give the answer, but the one thing that I know that happened for sure in 1971 is August 15th of 1971, Nixon broke with the gold standard. And you see the implications for the middle class. You can see big consequences for inflation, and historically you would call that debasing the currency. So what has happened though since then, up until recently, is all of the global commodities were settled in US dollars. And so a major component of US power hasn't just been our economy, it's been the fact that we are the reserve currency. So everything ultimately settles in dollars. And that's given us a massive amount of leverage in soft power, where we've been able to influence world events because we have insight into the whole monetary system. And we've kind of pushed that to its limits to the point now where people are looking to go outside of this system and develop a rival. We've also pushed that to the limits in terms of our own debt to GDP. So go back to less free. We're shackled by debt. So less free, less safe, more burdened by debt. The freedom part, I would say, is the Patriot Act. I'm not a big fan. That passed the Senate with 1 no vote. It was a Democrat. It passed the House with 63 no votes. It was about 2-to-1 Democrat to Republican. It's commonly thought of as a Republican bill because George W. Bush was the president, but it was overwhelmingly bipartisan. And I wish I could say with the benefit of hindsight that the country has learned from that. But when we decided to do the TikTok ban recently, it had really similar ratios. 50 Democrats and 15 Republicans. I was one that voted no. Not because I love TikTok. I don't even have a TikTok account. I do agree that China's harvesting all the data, but they're not exactly doing it differently than Mark Zuckerberg's doing with Facebook. And as he's openly telling, yes, I am being coerced by the government to do things, and I do them. And it seems like everybody's like, oh, this is fine. So, that is not what our Fourth Amendment says. That is not, it doesn't say if you have nothing to hide, then you have nothing to fear. Why would you need to fear your government? Your government is limited in what it can do to you in America because our founding fathers recognized that our rights don't come from government, they come from our Creator. They said famously in the Declaration that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the Ninth Amendment in our Constitution basically says that not all your rights are listed in the Constitution, and it says in the 10th Amendment that the ones not delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states. Now, that's not what we live by, but that is what we were founded on. And maybe when I talked about the founding principles and freedom, less free, I'll just mention as they were coming out of the Constitutional Convention, famously, someone asked Benjamin Franklin, what have you wrought, sir? What did you guys just create? What kind of government did you come up with? And he said, a republic, if you can keep it. Not, you the people, if people can keep it. And that has been tortured today. People recognized at the time that the challenge for democracies has been that once the people can vote themselves gifts from the Treasury, the countries go broke. And regardless of the form of the government, that's basically what happens. Once the government overspends and you debase the currency, you go bankrupt. There was a study about 15 years ago that showed that there were 52 countries in history that got a debt to GDP ratio slightly bigger than ours was at the end of World War II and only slightly bigger than ours is today. We're about 127% debt to GDP ratio, but this study said that once you cross 30%, 130%, 30% bigger than your economy, then 51 of 52 countries to reach that threshold have defaulted on their debt. I'm not positive, but generally you don't stay the reserve currency after that, right? So the only country that hasn't is Japan, and they're in the throes of defaulting on their currency today. They're actively being propped up, in markets right now. So that doesn't mean you can't just keep printing money, but it makes me suspect that that's true, right? So it's been tested 52 times, and so far 51, the result has been the same, default. And why do I mention that? Because the economy is foundational to strength. Part of the reason we were able to come in World War I and World War II and really be decisive in helping win them was we were at peace. The war wasn't taking place in our country. Our factories could produce. Part of the reason that the North beat the South in the Civil War is we had the industrial capacity of the country. And we've decided over the years to largely abandon industrial capacity. Our GDP rate of growth has been pretty nice. I'd like to see it be a little nicer. But I'd love to see it be less dependent upon the government component as a form of growth, because when it's only government, that tends to just be inflation. And that gives you the illusion of growth, it gives you the illusion of strength. But the industrial output is one of the things that belies that the strength isn't real. It's been pretty flat. And that's what households are experiencing. Their purchasing power is getting crushed if they don't already have a lot of assets that get inflated. And so you look in our own economy, in our own real-world experience, we're living with the consequences of hollowing out our economy. And certainly not the only reason that we've hollowed it out is foreign policy, but that is a big consequence because you misallocate resources. My apologies. And I will say, look, Scripture says there's a time for war and a time for peace, so that's of course true. If there was ever a time for war, it was post 9/11. That was an incredibly just war. But some parts of it seem to have been optional. So, for example, did we need to go to Iraq? Colin Powell came out and said we did, but what he said was a limited war for a limited purpose, find the weapons of mass destruction. So once that was over, that mission was over. But what they did with no vote and no accountability from Congress post that was essentially to create this idea, started in Afghanistan, spread immediately to Iraq, which is as much as it takes, as long as it takes, without saying to do what. And they would come up with things like, well, we're going to fight them over there instead of over here so that they don't attack us over here. But it was really just to kind of keep the war going and to kind of keep some of the things there. So what we saw, though, is even if you were going to do that, there's a smarter way to have done it. It seems, in the benefit of hindsight, kind of intuitive that if you drive down the same supply routes every day with big Army weapon systems and big Army presence, that you're going to get ambushed, right? I mean, senior level people aren't surprised by that. So why did they choose to do it? What you saw when the country really got fatigued from it, you did see the rise of ISIS. A little bit of hollowing out there, the rise of ISIS. But we thankfully didn't fight them the same way. We fought them with one of the principles of war, which is economy of force, which is a smart way to fight a war. And it was effective. We didn't leave a footprint that could be attacked every day. We had special operators in very small footprint places. They would find the leaders of these terror organizations within ISIS command structures and other affiliated terror groups and smoke them. And then they would break contact and leave. They didn't have a big fixed compound that they had to defend. If you had an airfield that was getting attacked, they could just break contact and leave, blow everything up, go somewhere else. They left nothing to be able to attack. That is a smarter way to accomplish a similar mission. And you did it with a lot less money. We spent about $7 trillion trying to create democratic republics of somewhere else instead of in our own country. And anytime through those years when I wasn't in elected office initially, and then when I first got elected, there were still going some of these wars. And to even as a member of Congress be on the committee of jurisdiction, unless you agreed with endless ill-defined wars, you wouldn't get on the committee of jurisdiction. So they would say, well, Congress isn't doing anything about it. So eventually this guy, Rodney Frelinghuysen, who was the chairman of appropriations, said, we're just going to cut off the funding. And I had just gotten elected then. I gave the guy a hug on the floor because it made sense. And he finally forced a debate. But they kept doing it anyway. They said, oh, that's the wrong way to do it. The speaker kind of moved it out, and they brought it back. So what they count on is that Congress will just shut up and cut the checks. And here we are again with another mission now in Ukraine where we've decided that see, when I was coming up through the Army, Colin Powell was a national security advisor. He became chief of staff of the Army. Then he became chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Then he became Secretary of State. And his base mantra was that before we get in a war, we should make sure that it's a vital national interest, and then we have a plan for what an end state is. How do we exit from this war? What do we call victory? And so from the get-go, when we looked at Ukraine, I said, let's define the mission. Because until you tell me what you're trying to accomplish, I don't really know whether I agree with the amount of resource requests you're asking for or not. And a lot of people will say, as much as it takes, as long as it takes. To do what? Well, just this last week, the European Union finally defined to do what? And this is what the European Union believes is their mission. They say that it will be no occupation of the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine, and Ukraine controls all of its own territory. And I think that's what a lot of people think that means. That includes Crimea, But we should be clear, Ukraine does not have enough personnel or combat power to do that, no matter how many weapons we send. So that is an escalation and expansion of the war if you're actually going to try to accomplish that mission. So the United States hasn't defined that. They've resisted this even in private, and they've variously said that it means that they can determine their own sovereignty, whatever that means. But then what they've got caught doing was scuttling the peace talks where Zelensky was trying to enter into some sort of negotiated settlement early in the war, and they got Zelensky to go on board with as much as it takes, as long as it takes. So instead of negotiating for a settled peace, they've continued to wage the war, and it's been very costly in blood and treasure for that. Now, if I was a Ukrainian, I might feel like I 100% agree with that. You know, this is Ukraine, we should extract all of them. I will say there are people who are Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine who say, well, I don't necessarily want to be part of Russia, but I certainly don't feel like we were being treated fairly within Ukraine because they were trying to keep us from, even in our own family, speaking Russian, which is what we've always done. We don't even know Ukrainian. So when I was speaking with someone like that, they said, the closest I could relate to you is if the people in Quebec wanted to keep speaking French and Canada just said, no, we're going to force you to speak English, that would create turmoil. It's not that Quebec necessarily wants to be its own country, though they did have separatists at one point, but they would prefer to be able to keep their cultural identity. It's like, that's kind of where a lot of the people are in eastern Ukraine that speak Russian. We're not necessarily sympathetic to Putin. They don't believe his cause is just, but they're not totally aligned with what the country of Ukraine is doing today or has done. Which kind of says to me, if you look at the history in Ukraine, there's been mostly periods of peace, but there's always been some level of conflict between Ukraine and Russia. There's some ethnic ties there, and you know, it's a long, complicated history. And for most of that, it hasn't been the United States deciding we were going to impose our will there. What the United States' position is, safe to say, is that Ukraine will be part of NATO, and eventually Ukraine will be part of the European Union. So this is what we've really done since the end of the Cold War. We've built an empire. We kind of started a foothold with the empire after World War II. We've seen the consolidation of the European Union as a bit of a counterweight economically, but then the United States decided that to stay in front of all this and make sure we have our influence everywhere, we're going to foot the bill for the security forces. So essentially, we're going to build the European Defense Force under the guise of NATO, and largely with US tax dollars, so that the Europeans can keep building their social welfare state and baiting in new members to the European Union. We'll just count on America to cut the checks and establish security for us. And that's where you've seen a lot of the big countries and big economies of Europe underfund their defense obligations. They're supposed to fund them, they don't. They're gradually working towards it in the wake of Ukraine and lots of American pressure under the Trump administration to do that, from not just President Trump, but from Secretary of State Pompeo. And I think that's where we are today. So here's the question. My base premise with Strength Through Peace is we don't have to get in all the wars we're invited to. We shouldn't seek out all extra ones to get involved with. And if we are going to fund a war, we should at least not fund both sides. And if you look in Israel, for example, we're funding both sides of the war. We're funding Israel, which frankly is a wealthy country and can afford to buy our weapons. They have a lower debt to GDP ratio than us by half, you know, high 50s, low 60s in their debt to GDP ratio. And yet the administration was withholding support from them. As I told folks, this administration, as predictably as gravity, will use any aid package as leverage to try to influence Netanyahu to take courses of action, limit the involvement, limit the expansion, shape the sovereignty of Israel. But the other side is, you know, you say, oh, well, there's humanitarian needs in Gaza, and that's real. There are humanitarian needs in Somalia. there's been humanitarian needs in all kinds of places. And wherever the United States has decided, or other countries do, we decide to do humanitarian aid as predictable as gravity. The people with the guns wind up with the aid. So that's what everyone on the ground is telling us in Gaza, is Hamas winds up with the aid. Like, who could have foreseen this? Everyone, right? And so as this was moving through Congress, we tried to strip that part out and say, we're going to pick a side or we're not going to fund it. And so I took the vote that politically, in our current scheme, certainly for Republican, not an easy no vote, but I voted no. I'm not going to fund both sides of a war. We did this with ISIS. We had the moderate Muslim funding with DOD fighting the moderate Muslims that the CIA identified. And they were fighting each other. And you're like, shouldn't we pick one side to fund? And so this is what happens when you are defending an empire. Last thing I'll say, and then I'll take your questions on this, is, you know, one of the base components of a sovereign country is that you have secure borders. And for a lot of Western civilization, we've decided to abandon that concept and just essentially have mass migration, flooding the European Union and flooding the United States of America. I don't think you can have a sovereign country without a secure border. I think citizenship matters, and particularly in a country where we do have some form of social safety net that, frankly, for certainly refugees, people that we should be welcoming to legally, is actually more generous than it is for retirees in Social Security and Medicare. And that creates inherent conflict within the culture. I'm seeing it in my former district and now nearby, no longer in my congressional district, in Springfield, Ohio. So you see the limits even of legal immigration, but you see lots of problems where you have only the e pluribus part out of many. Our country's motto was e pluribus unum, out of many, one. And this idea of unity of a binding culture, a binding way of life, a binding vision for the future, not necessarily uniform in our ideas or values or even our faith, but uniform in the values established in our Constitution. And that's why Ben Franklin said, a republic, if you keep it. One of the best book titles I've heard of, I can't say I endorse every idea in the book, but he was one of the guys sounding the alarm, was Pat Buchanan's book, A Republic, Not an Empire. And I look often, if we had heeded some of those warnings, and in the post-Cold War win, decided to have a focused foreign policy instead of an expansive nation-building one. If we had heeded calls from people like Ron Paul, who I think is an isolationist, but the reality is everyone was dismissed who was a realist. Realism is not isolationism. But the neoconservative movement took over the Republican Party under the George W. Bush administration. They trotted out Colin Powell as a man with great credibility on limited wars and defined missions, and then they seized complete control of the power. And the Republican Party has gone along with that all the way up until the Trump administration, where they said, no, our beliefs and values are different. Republic, that's why we're the Republican Party. Dwight Eisenhower was never accused of being an isolationist. He was, I think hopefully everyone in the room knows who he was. Not only was one of our presidents, he was a 5-star general, led D-Day, led Normandy, phenomenal career, West Point graduate, and I think incredibly influential for our history. But when he came into office in 1953, the 52 campaign for president, the Korean War was going on. He came in and he helped resolve peacefully the Korean War. Now, people say that was unjust because all of the Korean peninsula should be free and prosperous like South Korea. But if we had left, all of the peninsula would be, in despair like North Korea. Maybe the place on earth that you can see this strength through peace most clearly and the importance of America's involvement in the world is South Korea. But for America's involvement, that whole peninsula would be like North Korea. And frankly, but for China's involvement, and I don't just mean in the years between 1950 and 1953, I mean to this day, the whole peninsula could be like South Korea. First world economy, first world healthcare, frankly, a mission-sending country. So the ideas really matter. But think what we were able to do because we were able to go for a negotiated peace. We were able to focus on our own economy. Eisenhower famously pivoted off of that and invested massively in American infrastructure. We saw peace and prosperity in our own economy that was enduring until we got into the Vietnam War, and then we decided massive expansion of the welfare state too, which led to 1971, an expansion of the war on poverty and more wars. So these endless wars with no defined win are leaving our country less free, less safe, more burdened by debt. And if you read or reread Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, this is the same thing that happens. You hollow out your economy because you overcommit. You hollow out your national security because you overcommit. And if something can't continue, it eventually stops, just like the Roman Empire did, just like so many other empires. Empires fail. And so we should seek to, while we still can, restore a government small enough to fit back in the Constitution. We could actually afford a government that size, and we could actually defend our republic. I think that reorientation would mean that we defend our sovereign borders as well. So happy to take your questions as long as you guys want to stick around. I know you got something else going on later today for a lot of you, but thanks for coming in and hearing this talk.
Thank you. Congressman Davidson, that was a real tour de force, and it's really a target-rich environment for questions or comments. What I would do is I'm happy to recognize people. I've got a microphone. Ronald Reagan famously said, I paid for that microphone. I didn't pay for this one, but I've got it. So if I recognize you, I'll give you the microphone, and I'd ask you two things: to identify yourself and to limit your question or your comments. We had one keynote address. We don't need multiple ones. So who'd like to kick things off? So just remember, academics abhor a vacuum. And if you don't ask questions, I'm going to. Please.
Thank you very much, Congressman. That was a wonderful talk. My name's Dave Heskin. I'm a chemical engineering grad from 1969. I am older than Mike, so I know all these people, and I think Eisenhower was a great president. My question is, and that was one of the first things you talked about, the expansion of executive power versus the legislative. And I feel that way too. Why do you think that's happened, and what can you do to bring things back in equilibrium?
Yeah, thank you. I think, look, the reason that the founders put the power to declare wars in Article 1, which is the legislative branch, is outlined in Federalist 69. So if you want to reread Federalist 69 or read it for the first time, it's a good outline of the Founding Fathers' view of why you do it. And they were looking at history and the abuse of executive power. How do you get overextended? Well, a king can just decide. And on things that, frankly, Eisenhower warned against in his farewell address, he cautioned against two things. The one is famous, the military-industrial complex, and the other was the scientific technical elite. I would say Fauci might epitomize that, for example. And why? Because both bodies are trusted by the public, and they have domain expertise that people want to continue to trust, but because of the asymmetry in power and influence, they have an opportunity, if not unchecked, to put their own interest in the truth at odds with America's interest. And we've certainly seen that, I think, in both realms, I think, to be a prescient caution by Eisenhower. And so I think really you started seeing it erode right as post-Eisenhower. And you saw it kind of go away with Vietnam. You saw it try to be reasserted with the War Powers Resolution. And in theory, that's a privileged resolution. So I saw multiple people bring that up since I've been a member of Congress in all sorts of conflicts. But the rules of the House need changed, and I will every time continue to try to fight this battle that gets a little wonky, which is if you make a resolution privileged, which is any one member can make the resolution, the whole point of that is that the body has to consider it. But you also have this rules of the House that allow someone to immediately make a motion to table. And so then what you get is a vote on tabling it. So the majority doesn't technically have to go on record for the underlying question that's privileged. They just say, well, I agree with tabling. It's not really the right time to have the debate. So they said that all the time with respect to the War Powers Resolution. I think the intent behind it was good, but it's always neutered by this motion to table. And we need to change that. You could say whether something should or shouldn't be privileged, like motion to vacate the chair. We had that twice this Congress. And both times I voted against tabling because you should actually consider the underlying resolution. It's privileged for a reason. So that's one of the reasons Congress wants their power taken away, and they prove it by continuing to just table things. And the fact that they will just shut up and cut the checks proves it. And then the fact that they use regulatory capture, which the military-industrial complex and scientific technical elite both use to say, if you really want to reform this, well, you're not going to be on the Committee of Jurisdiction. I eventually broke through and got on Foreign Affairs. Safe to say I'd be a long shot to become chairman. There's zero chance so far that I've been able to get on Intel because I really want to massively reform the Patriot Act and the surveillance program, and very safe to say I won't be chosen to chair the Committee of Jurisdiction. And I would argue that the founders thought that the people that were the biggest defenders of freedom would be the strongest advocates in the legislative branch to check executive power. That's gone away. And I think, look, the founding fathers cautioned against factions, which political parties. It didn't take long until they formed their own parties. Even in their own lifetime, they all became partisans. But you see, in a lot of ways, our system isn't a lot different than a parliamentary system. When our party, as Republicans, are in power, even though I thought there were times we should be bringing in certain executive branch figures to the woodshed for a little therapy session with Congress, we tend to give a pass to our own administration, and Democrats do the same. I think our founding fathers, when they were at least at the Constitutional Convention, would have been surprised by that, but they pretty quickly in their own lifetimes abandoned it. And so we haven't adapted our Constitution to the convenience of power politics with parties. And then lastly, I'll say our system has endured a two-party system for a long time, very brief periods where you saw transitional phases where you had a third party that was truly significant. And that's if you just study game theory. Pairwise comparison is one of the easiest ways to rig a game. And I'm not saying any of our system is rigged, but it is an easy game to rig pairwise comparison. You channel everything into better one, better two, and simplify the decision. And so if you want to break through those things, I think you have to look at those layers. And that's really it. I think like one of the big surprises, I mean, everyone, I think, all but about 10% of the country agrees that Congress is broken. But when you get there, you find that it's broken for a whole layer of reasons. And I think that's, some of the layers.
Hi, I'm Catherine. Ooh, sorry. Thank you so much for being here to speak to us today. It was really interesting and really insightful, and I'm glad you can come back to campus. I'm a sophomore studying global affairs. I'm also an NDISC fellow, which is why I'm here. I was wondering, you touched upon in the sort of start of your talk a bit about like the economic power that the U.S. has. And so when thinking about the ability to have strength through peace, like a lot of our ability to be peaceful, I think, comes from the fact that we're really well respected, which is also coming from our economic power. So how do you see the ability to enact peaceful measures like in countries that have less economic power? And then also when we're thinking about peace, typically the means in which we enact peace maybe will be through like appeasement and things like that. Do you see that there's a greater obligation or incentive to not appease countries, especially when you're less economically like strong, to sort of prove strength in other ways? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. And, I think economic interdependence is basically the theory that, hey, everyone that trades together tends to get along better. And, yeah, I want to buy into that, but I will just say that at the start of World War II, who was Germany's biggest trading partner? France, right? So right now, who's our biggest trading partner? China. And as the economy tends to be important, rivals develop economies too. And I think the hope is that you keep it interdependent, but just like when you saw the change in leadership in Germany, I won't say just like it because there's only one Adolf Hitler, so there's no good analogy for Hitler. But you saw a massive change in China when you went from Hu Jintao to Xi Jinping. And that was very much on display at the last People's Congress when Hu Jintao was basically perp walked out in front of everyone in the nation. So I think you want the interdependence, and I will say, look, as a former Army Ranger, I never thought I was going to China without body armor, a rucksack full of ammo, and night vision goggles, right? And when I got out and got into business, and I looked at the rules of the road that had been negotiated, we've become very interdependent with China. In manufacturing, which is the field that I got involved in, all of my customers were getting a lot of their stuff there, and if I wanted to participate in that supply chain, then I had to find a way to integrate with it in a lot of my niche. So I traveled there pretty regularly. The people are awesome. Their government's terrible, and they have very little chance to change it. We at least have some hope of changing ours. And so I think, yes, we should always trade, but I think, like, if you think about free trade, for example, no one has free trade with China. I mean, one of the things that Donald Trump did was call attention to the problems with China's approach to trade. And when they were admitted to the World Trade Organization, they promised to become a market economy, and they're not. No one considers China a market economy for very obvious reasons. They're not. And I thought that they were doing the right thing to focus on trade. I didn't think they had the right approach. I will say I think every military academy in the world will tell you you're more likely to win a war, hot or cold, if you multiply your allies than if you multiply your enemies. So I thought the approach of let's go to a trade war with everyone all at once was flawed. And I was able to say that as much to President Trump and really his trade czar, Peter Navarro. Nevertheless, they didn't change course. I thought what you should do is, look, China does this. They block market access. They steal your intellectual property. Not just allow companies to steal it. They cooperatively use their intelligence apparatus to steal and harvest intellectual property. They subsidize and dump very strategically to take over key markets for their own defense supply chain and their own economic strength. And America very foolishly has allowed this to happen, and I would argue in some ways has willfully enabled it. Argue later about the motives, but I think, hard to believe that it was just negligence on some of these things, right? So what are we going to do to correct it? I think if we could look at our existing allies around the world and focus on our real security needs by peacefully resolving Ukraine, we would say it's not in our interest for Russia and China to develop an alliance, which they're doing and growing. And it's not in your industry interest to continue fueling this with Russia's dependence on their energy economy and China's defense manufacturing base. So we should be doing things together to confront that. And instead, I think China's very happy to see us continue to be distracted and focusing on somewhere else other than the Asia-Pacific. And they would love us to stay in an endless war in Ukraine, and frankly, so would Russia. They're going to outlast China, at least on manpower. They have no domestic pressure on Putin to somehow he's going to lose power in Russia, and there's no domestic pressure that for the foreseeable future is going to cause Xi Jinping to lose power in China. So I think we should learn from Eisenhower, resolve our situation, and get focused.
Howdy, my name is Andre. I'm a history and political science major. I'm a sophomore, and I'm also an NDISC fellow. And I suppose I would really ask how responding to, I suppose, Chinese economic and political coercion that's taking place throughout the world, specifically in the global south, how kind of you would respond to that as a kind of a broader part of your strategy.
Yeah, thank you. This is really important. If you look at countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, they are huge exporters of cobalt, which isn't necessarily rare earth, but you see also other things that are rare earth minerals. And a lot of this is used in electric. So I would do things that make us less dependent upon something that China is dominant in the global supply chain, like EV mandates, for example, like killing power generation in America and promoting low-cost power generation in China. So everything about the Paris Climate Accord, for example, is great for China, but terrible for America. It's frankly terrible for Germany. They foolishly are turning off their nuclear power plants, and now they're like, wow, we can't competitively make things in Germany anymore. Germany's been their powerhouse on industrial capacity, but they can't have an export-led growth model in Germany if they can't afford the cost of electricity, right? So don't do dumb stuff. Like, life's hard. It's especially hard when you do dumb stuff. And that's, I think, what they're doing with some of this, kind of climate initiative. And look, I'm not saying it's not an important consideration, but it is not the driving consideration. And what it's doing is driving us into capitulation to a Chinese-dominated supply chain. And that is the fate we're leaving countries with in the global south, particularly if they have resources. And we, under the Obama administration in particular, but partially during the same shift under George W. Bush, when the neoconservatives, and this would be like the Dick Cheney wing of the party, the neoconservative is just another word for not conservative. All right, so, and now they're like a virus invading a new host. They've decided that the Democrats can now become their host because they're also not conservatives. And they just want as much as it takes, as long as it takes, to keep fueling their own interests. And so continue to rid the country of this invasive ideology, restore our republic, for one. But two, if you look at where this is going in our institutions, the International Monetary Fund has something called special drawing rights, which is a basket of currencies, which promotes interest among all of the countries that have their own currencies. So most of the European countries gave up theirs and adopted the euro. Pound sterling's there, Japanese yen is there, but now the RMB is there. Well, China is actively trying to undermine the International Monetary Fund with their Belt and Road Initiative, and not only did they decide to include the RMB in the basket of currencies, they continue to expand its influence within the basket of currencies, the percentage weight of it. So I would end that immediately. So there's a couple things.
Thank you, Congressman. My name's Tommy. I'm a 1L at the law school. I was wondering if you could be a little clearer on the distinguishing between immediately after World War II and contemporary geopolitics. It seems like 1947, America's also an empire. Marshall Plan, a lot of that stuff seems kind of superficially similar to NATO, and the spreading of American influence in Europe. Could you maybe speak a little more on why Marshall Plan good, IMF good, WTO good, Bretton Woods good, and kind of contemporary expansion of NATO influence is how that's not doing the same thing as post-World War II American influence in Europe? Yeah,
thanks for the question and a great observation. And look, I think the point of the Marshall Plan was not to make America purely an empire. Certainly we wanted to raise our prominence and interconnectedness, but the other part was to get the Europeans at a level where they could become consumers of our stuff. And if we were really trying to undermine Germany's economy, we would have said, oh no, we want to do things that disincentivize you making things. We'll trust ourselves to be the makers of things. You just take our export-led growth and buy our stuff. But we didn't do that. We wanted to rebuild their economies. We did the same to Japan. We didn't try to dominate and colonize Japan or Germany. rebuild, be strong. And look today, the next largest economies are China, or aside from China, are Germany and Japan. And for the longest time, they were the next peer economies. And so, of course, Britain rebuilt theirs, and they've been strong for a long time. So it was exactly not to totally be an empire. If you look at NATO, Eisenhower's got a great quote. I can't deliver it, but he said, if in 10 years we're still in NATO, this would be considered a failure. Because at the end of the war, Truman asked him to take over and become commander of NATO. And so he went over there and established it. He has quotes from, I want to say 49-ish, if you look it up, where he's talking about it would be a failure to say that we need to keep doing this forever with NATO. It's designed to get them to be strong again, not to get them to become our dependents. If you look at the concept behind NATO, expansion, if you look at where NATO expansion has occurred, it's aligned with the EU expansion. We decided to integrate and essentially become a component so that the Europeans don't have to invest in defense. They rely on us to invest in defense. And somehow that soothes everyone's conscience, but it also helps, yeah, okay, you don't necessarily need to develop your own systems, you can buy ours. And we pump that out. In a way, that's good. We need strong defense industrial base. If you're not in big wars, you need to produce some of the gear. But we're not doing that. So if you look at ships, for example, because we decided to spend 20 years shooting $1 million missiles at Toyota pickup trucks in the Middle East, we didn't build a big enough Navy fleet, We haven't focused on Asia-Pacific adequately. We couldn't get the Air Force to focus on space, so we had to break it out of the Air Force and set up Space Command separately. So this allocation of resources is really important. Time is one of the biggest things. And I will say, look, in my own opinion, woke mind virus is totally wrecking the focus in the military. You can say, oh, well, people know, whatever. They're going to focus on the mission. Well, yeah, if you tie up their Saturday morning talking all about some kind of woke ideology instead of letting them go train, well, that's a day that they didn't train. If you spend all the money on eco-friendly $400 a gallon jet fuel instead of $7 a gallon jet fuel, they don't have the training resources left to get flight hours, and that's when the Apaches start getting degraded because they can't get them in the air. So there really are consequences for how you allocate your priorities. And in a macro sense, I think that's what's happened, whether it's NATO or the kind of ill-defined endless war thing.
Thank you. Cynthia O'Brien. I'm a former Navy wife, still married, he's just out of the Navy, current Marine mom. So this is kind of a selfish question. You said, we don't have to go to every war we're invited to, which I appreciate, but does that change your thoughts on budgeting or expansion of the military? Are you thinking keeping the same size and a bigger budget or a smaller budget? What are your thoughts there if we're not going to those parties?
Yeah, so I mean, we spend about $1 trillion a year on our defense budget right now, and I don't really feel like we're over-investing in defense dollars, but I think we're misallocating the resources. So we don't have a secure border. The idea that we secure our own borders shouldn't be controversial. It should be essential. I think we should continue to be a welcoming country. I think it should be easier to be here legally, but it should be like completely unacceptable that you're here illegally. That's the way it is most everywhere in the world. And they're nowhere near as powerful as we are, and nowhere near the kind of security threats that we are. And for what it's worth, I think that recruiting would go off the charts if people knew they were enlisting in the military to defend our country instead of defend some empire. I mean, I talk to guys like, look, I want to raise a family. I love serving in the military, but I don't want to deploy to Africa 3 more times. I hope those guys have nice, peaceful lives, but I want to defend my country, and I don't see how going back and forth to Africa all the time is defending my country right now. And yeah, okay, I get it. And I think that's kind of the allocation. The last thing I'll say is there was a point in time in the Green Zone, which is this area in Iraq when we were fighting the Iraq War, the second one, the bigger, longer, more poorly executed one. we had 90 generals, I think 93, 90 plus general officers in the green zone. Right, that's insane, right? Well, they all wanted in on it, 90 generals. Like, if you go back to World War II, we won World War II with a ratio of 1 officer, not just general officer, 1 officer per 30 enlisted soldiers. And right now, it's like 1 to 8 or 9. Like, the ratio is crazy. So we're fat on the officer corps. We're fat on these things that aren't even focused on fighting or winning wars. And it's the same within the CIA. We have roughly the same number of intelligence analysts and human intelligence assets as we had at 9/11. But the budget is off the charts. We have all this staff and everything else out there, and it's like, what are you doing? And it's all tail and no tooth. And I won't go into the percentage of our military, for obvious reasons, that is actually deployable right now. I mean, it's insane. So, yeah, I think we need a stronger military than we have today, but the way that strength is provided is by making them focused. They're not focused. They're always deploying on all kinds of things, and that's not to say there's no value in it, or certainly at the macro sense, we haven't had another major terrorist attack against 9/11, against our homeland since 9/11. But that's the same. You look at the illustration of the initial part of Iraq, 03/04 through 8, 9, 10, 11. By 11, it was definitely ISIS that was dominating things. And the way we defeated ISIS versus the way we were waging the Iraq War. Both provided peace and stability, but one was efficient, and one just kept the war going.
Thanks for your time. My name is Marco. I'm an undergrad. I want to ask you a little bit about something that you said a couple minutes ago, which was that we haven't adequately focused on the Asia Pacific. And it seems to me like Asia is probably the place that you really want to implement strength through peace. I'm interested specifically in, I guess, what the physical U.S. presence should be in Asia. It seems to me like something like AUKUS, for example, is a really interesting idea at first, which is that we can give other countries capabilities to defend themselves better. Although Australia might be a little bit further out from China, we can maybe do similar things for the Japanese and the South Koreans. But it also doesn't seem to me like we actually have the capability or the capacity to fulfill something like AUKUS. We can't really even build submarines right now. So it seems like our industrial base has atrophied to the point where it's difficult to adequately focus on Asia. So I guess the first question is, what does it mean to adequately focus on Asia? What's our presence there? And the second is, how do we actually build in order to get there?
Yeah, I think it's integrated because we have a great relationship with Japan and with South Korea. South Korea in particular does have a great shipbuilding operation. There's no reason we couldn't be using South Korea to build ships for us, Japan to build ships for us, and we have recently partnered with Australia to help build submarines for us. So you see major investments in submarines and intelligence sharing. You look at the kind of Five Eyes kind of mindset. So there are things we're doing that are already promoting some of that interdependence. But I think we need a bigger fleet, but we also need people willing and capable of doing it. And right now we can't even we don't even have 300 ships in our Navy. I mean, when I enlisted in the Army, the Navy had over 600 ships, right? And yeah, we could afford to take some ships off the table. Some of them were old and needed retired, but that didn't mean they don't need replaced. We made really dumb investment decisions about a really ineffective Littoral class ship, and so they're trying to fix that. But yeah, I think that's the challenge. Is manpower is one of the things. So if you look at it, we don't even have enough staffing right now to man all the ships that we would want to go to sea with. And part of the way that we do that is inspiring people to defend our country. And I don't think you do that by running it down and saying somehow we were colonialists or we're some evil place. I mean, we are the world's land of opportunity, and it should be self-evident. People from all over the planet want to come here because they've been there. And they want to be here, whether they do it legally or illegally. And we're not inspiring our young people in adequate numbers to do it. I will tell you some of the most impressive people I see today in your peer group, and some of you are them, are the people that want to volunteer to go serve. That's why I think the all-volunteer service is such an important thing, because the country is committed at that point. That's why I think the founders made it clear that the legislature, the people's house, is the body that declares our wars, because you don't want a small niche of people waging a low-key, low-simmer war that is obligating our country. That's why great nations don't fight endless wars. Great nations fight decisive wars. They wage battles because when we go to war as a country. And we're not doing that. And empires do that. Republics don't. And I think in Asia, we shouldn't find a way to get into some wars in Asia and decide that's going to make us safe, but we should build our defense industrial base and our alliances with people that frankly know they're pretty dependent upon us for their security. Personally, I think you got to look at that probably a little differently in Taiwan, but that's one of the most debated subjects. And I will say, I wouldn't say that in every setting, because part of having a successful State Department is having a strong negotiating position. And that's also part of how Eisenhower was able to get a negotiated peace, is he did show that he was willing to use quite a lot of strength, even in tactical nukes. And that helped resolve the peace situation pretty well.
Thank you. This is an amazing presentation. Thank you. Valerie Pana from Boston. So you spoke a lot about China, Russia, and I've been curious about whether there is a thought that Russia may have provoked this conflict with Ukraine to draw the borders of NATO essentially closer to it as its own insulation against threats from China. And concurrently with that question, there is a lot of opportunity for our own business class, which is very obviously interrelated with our own government, who wants to do a lot of development on the border of Ukraine, Russia. And is that so seductive that it makes it difficult to withdraw or create peace?
Yeah, on your second point, that's definitely a factor. I mean, BlackRock's running the transition team, right, to help us pay for rebuilding Ukraine, which is clearly America's obligation, right? No, it's not. But so here's the timeline of events that I think is relevant to the conflict in Ukraine. In 2013, Ukraine was on the verge of entering into a trade agreement with the European Union that a lot of people believed would begin to tip the balance towards Ukraine integrating with the European Union. And this was like November timeframe. But then Russia made a much sweeter deal because they wanted to keep Ukraine linked to Russia. And ultimately, their leader said, great, I will take the Russian deal instead of the European Union deal. Well, that led to instability, both because a lot of people in Ukraine wanted the European Union deal and the European Union integration, and also because some European Union allied, NATO allied people decided to influence elections. So you had the Maidan coup, shortly after that. Well, that would have been 2013. So into 2012 was the trade agreement. Started 2013's Maidan coup. And then you see right after that, 2014, ultimately, Russia took Crimea. Because they're not going to give up the Black Sea Fleet. I mean, they're just not. I mean, that is an existential threat to Russia's ability to project power. Essentially, their navy is massively less capable if they don't have access to a warm water port, and that is Crimea. So they have a small port in Syria, which is worth noting. But if you look, I think that here's how the escalation went more recently. So America left Afghanistan on August 31st of 2021. Now, I think in the macro sense, yeah, we probably should diminish our influence there. The way we left was terrible. You don't have to have been in the military to know that first you get the civilians out, then the military, not the other way around. So a disaster in every respect. But the very next day, on September 1st of 2021, the Biden administration entered into a strategic partnership agreement with Ukraine to support their membership into NATO and the European Union. So you saw all that fall, continued escalation with Putin and Russia, And of course, if Ukraine's a sovereign country, they could decide to do that, but that doesn't mean that there won't be tension over it. Well, instead of appeasing or working through those tensions and saying, here's how we see this working out, they continued to escalate it and simply say, it's our sovereign right to do it. America said, we're with Ukraine. That's the point of our strategic agreement. We're backing Ukraine. The European Union did the same. On February 22nd of 2022, Jens Stoltenberg, who is now departing or soon to depart as Secretary General of NATO, gave a speech about the importance of NATO's ability to project power around the world, including in Asia. Like, I thought NATO was a defensive alliance. Why would NATO be focused on projecting power? And I think Putin had the same kind of question. So on February 24th of 2022, Putin invades Ukraine. Now, some of the intelligence assessments that are public on that say that there were units that thought they were still doing a training exercise. They weren't really planning to invade. So I do think that Putin thought that there would be a negotiated settlement pretty quick. And our intelligence said that he will roll up and collapse Ukraine right away. In fact, someone offered Zelensky, either that or it's a great cover story, that offered him a ride out. And, you know, in a very inspiring response, whether it was crafted or spontaneous, he said, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. And great, he inspired his own country and the rest of the world to pour resources in and help him defend Ukraine. But I think that immediately after that, by April, there were peace negotiations going on. And that's where the United States scuttled them. Helmut Kohl in Germany outed that in Der Spiegel. It's reported in other parts of the world. It's not reported by the controlled media in our country, but it's true. We scuttled it, and part of the way we scuttled it is we promised an unlimited open checkbook. So that open checkbook is shifting to pledging assets, and I will say part of the way that they persuaded Trump to be for more of this is we'll extend it as debt. They won't have the ability to repay it. They'll default. We'll control their industry and their economy. That's an empire. That's not a republic. We don't want an empire as a country. I don't believe our country does, but a lot of our leaders have committed us to this.
So I think we have time for one more question, and we have a student, which is a good way to end. As you may know, Congressman Davidson's district includes the university that we're taking on today, and I think the congressman is going to need to do some, you know, pre-game sort of comforting given the inevitable outcome.
Camaraderie is one of the best parts of sports.
That's right. That's right. So, Edward.
Thank you for coming today, Congressman Davidson. I guess one question I'd quickly ask is, at the beginning of your talk, you put a really big emphasis on limited government and also inflation problems facing Americans. So how do you kind of deal with China's trade practices while also maintaining limited government? Because I think the current approach puts a lot of emphasis on tariffs as well as industrial policy, like the Chips and Science Act, for example. So how do we kind of balance countering China while simultaneously keeping costs low for Americans and having limited government?
I appreciate that question very much. So there are some of my colleagues who believe that the way to counter China is to be like China. We need a command economy too. We need to direct our industrial policy. China's developing a central bank digital currency, which is the creepiest surveillance tool known to man, and they can control their population. They can use it to know how everybody's spending money, who they're spending it with, where they're doing. They can link it to social credit score, and it's very compatible with the same mindset that produced the Patriot Act and the cancellation of free speech under TikTok ban, you know, which is exactly what we're trying to do. And we're trying to do it for the exact same reason. A lot of my colleagues believe that the way to counter China is to be more like China. Now, they might not agree to those words, but that's the effect of the policy. And because they want no trade-offs for our domestic spending for all these endeavors, they don't want to try to live within our means. And I think that's exactly it. If we actually said, you know, we have to have a government small enough to fit back in the Constitution, we could actually afford a government that small. And part of the way we would be able to afford it is by trusting our allies like South Korea, like Japan, like Australia, like good allies in Europe and frankly elsewhere to do more good things. But frankly, the current administration's State Department spends more time coercing people to have Pride Month and more abortions than they do our own rational self-interest. They're doing this in Ecuador and Guatemala, countries that are conservative, and they're pushing back. We caught them having a meeting of the Guatemalan legislature to try to coerce them to fire the Attorney General. The Attorney General is investigating the Biden administration for their collaboration with cartels on sex trafficking and human trafficking. Well, Guatemala desperately wants to use their narrow choke point geographically to limit the flow of migration, not just into America, but into their own country. And they would love to put some of that labor to work with an investment. So we could see massive investment out of China into our own hemisphere. We could restore the base concept behind the Monroe Doctrine, that we would have a special interest in security in our own hemisphere, and we could benefit from asymmetries in cost of labor and median income in these economies. It would decrease migration, it would increase security, it would minimize China's presence there, and I think it would stop bankrupting us. And so, you know, if we lived within our means, we would need to partner with other people to do the same things. And I think in that way, our values are contagious. I mean, most people don't want to live under an authoritarian system, even in China. They would rather have freedom. And you go back to the border. They knew they were suffering from a fatal overdose of government in East Germany, and they wanted more freedom. And so basic, restore government small enough to fit within the Constitution recipe, more freedom, less government, sound money, and secure borders. I think that's what we need. So look, it's an honor to be able to represent you. I can't believe we have young people that spent this kind of time on a football Saturday, hanging out, listening to some hillbilly from Southern Ohio. But if you're ever over our way, we'd be honored to see you, whether that's in Ohio. It goes from Cincinnati about a third of the way up the state line. Doesn't have either Cincinnati or Dayton in it, but it's essentially right there. Or if you get to our little outpost of freedom in Washington, D.C., we're in the Rayburn House Office building. And you know, Gus Desch, who bears a striking resemblance to the gentleman to my right, is one of my legislative assistants on our staff. So it's an honor to be able to join you. Go Irish.
Thank you. Congressman Davidson, this was such a wide-ranging and thoughtful talk. I've been trying to text with our AD, Pete Baklava, to cancel the game so we don't have the pressure.
The ratings will drop.
Yeah. But for some reason, he's not answering my text. So I think we've got to not only thank you for a marvelous set of remarks, and his meeting with the military MBA students this morning was equally wide-ranging, but also welcome you back to your alma mater, the University of Notre Dame. So please join me in another round of applause.
Thanks, Mike. That's great.